Hello viewers, welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we will be discuss the topic trauma doesn't end when the event is over. How trauma rewires the mind, reshapes emotions, and silently affects daily life for years. We'll uncover 5 powerful psychological effects that trauma leaves behind. So stay tuned. Number 1. Emotional dysregulation. Emotional dysregulation is one of the most pervasive and enduring psychological consequences of trauma, especially when the trauma is complex, prolonged, or experienced during critical developmental periods. At its core, emotional dysregulation refers to a persistent inability to manage, interpret, or respond to emotional experiences in a way that is adaptive or contextually appropriate. Trauma dysregulates the autonomic nervous system, shifting it into states of chronic hyperarousal characterized by anxiety, agitation, and anger, or hypoarousal marked by numbness, apathy, and disconnection. These physiological imbalances translate into fluctuating emotional states, often beyond the survivor's control. The amygdala, which governs fear processing and emotional reactivity, tends to become hyperactive in trauma survivors, leading to exaggerated responses to perceived threats, even when such threats are minimal or non-existent. Concurrently, the prefrontal cortex, which is essential for rational thought and emotional regulation, often demonstrates decreased functioning, meaning that trauma survivors lack the necessary executive oversight to mitigate strong emotional impulses. Over time, this imbalance results in individuals experiencing rapid shifts in mood, difficulties in identifying and labeling emotions, and disproportionate emotional reactions to everyday events. Emotional dysregulation also includes difficulties with impulse control, such as sudden outbursts of anger, crying, or panic, which are frequently followed by shame, guilt, or confusion. These unpredictable emotional patterns impair relationships, self-esteem, and everyday functioning. Furthermore, the lack of emotional predictability fosters avoidance behaviors as the individual begins to fear their own reactions. Without treatment, these maladaptive coping mechanisms, including substance abuse, self-harm, or emotional suppression, become deeply entrenched. This not only exacerbates the original dysregulation but also introduces additional mental health concerns. Emotional dysregulation may also influence identity development, especially in younger individuals, as the frequent shifts in emotional states make it difficult to form a coherent and stable self-concept. Moreover, emotional dysregulation complicates the therapeutic process itself. Survivors may find it difficult to remain engaged in therapy when emotionally overwhelmed, or may resist revisiting traumatic material out of fear of losing emotional control. Over time, the physiological and psychological stress of constant emotional upheaval can manifest in somatic symptoms such as gastrointestinal distress, chronic fatigue, or cardiovascular issues. Therefore, the impact of emotional dysregulation is both intrapsychic and systemic, permeating multiple domains of life and health. Interventions such as dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, mindfulness practices, and somatic-based therapies aim to restore regulatory functioning by developing distress tolerance, emotional awareness, and interpersonal effectiveness. However, the process of restoring emotional equilibrium is long and requires sustained, trauma-informed intervention. In sum, emotional dysregulation is not merely a symptom of trauma but a complex, deeply rooted adaptation to prolonged distress that significantly impairs emotional life, decision-making, and the capacity for intimacy and self-understanding. Number 2. Distorted self-image. A distorted self-image is a long-term psychological consequence of trauma that affects the foundational structure of identity and self-concept. When an individual experiences trauma, particularly interpersonal trauma such as emotional abuse, sexual violence, or chronic neglect, their understanding of themselves is shaped by the emotional and cognitive frameworks active during and after the event. A distorted self-image often forms through the internalization of blame, shame, and guilt, leading survivors to develop core beliefs that they are inherently bad, unworthy, or fundamentally damaged. These beliefs do not remain isolated thoughts but rather become embedded into the individual's cognitive schema, influencing how they perceive themselves, others, and the world. This process of internalized degradation is often exacerbated by the fact that trauma disrupts normal developmental trajectories, particularly when it occurs in childhood. When caregivers are the source of trauma, the developing child has no alternative models of self-worth or relational safety, and thus, the only way to maintain some psychological coherence is to believe that the trauma was deserved. This survival-based adaptation becomes the bedrock for a fragmented or negative self-image. In adulthood, this can manifest as chronic self-criticism, feelings of inadequacy, perfectionism, or persistent shame that is impervious to logic or reassurance. Even in the absence of current threats, the individual may experience themselves as irreparably broken or defective, which contributes to depression, social withdrawal, and existential despair. These distortions also impair the individual's ability to establish boundaries or advocate for themselves, as they may feel undeserving of respect or care. Moreover, the distorted self-image often becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Survivors may unconsciously gravitate toward toxic relationships or sabotage positive opportunities because these scenarios align with their internal narrative. In therapy, these entrenched beliefs can create resistance to healing, as the client may reject positive feedback, minimize their own suffering, or believe they do not deserve recovery. The dissociation of parts of the self, common in trauma survivors, can further fracture identity, resulting in confusion about values, preferences, and personal goals. Therapeutic modalities like internal family systems, IFS, schema therapy, and trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy aim to address these distortions by helping clients reauthor their internal narratives and foster self-compassion. Reconstructing a healthier self-image requires not only cognitive restructuring but also emotional and relational experiences that contradict the survivor's negative beliefs. Over time, with consistent therapeutic support, individuals can begin to reclaim a sense of self-worth and identity that is not defined by their trauma. However, the process is gradual and non-linear, as these distortions are often deeply enmeshed with a survivor's coping mechanisms and sense of self. In conclusion, a distorted self-image is a profound and enduring psychological impact of trauma that reshapes how individuals view themselves and live their lives, affecting every layer of their mental and emotional landscape. Chronic hypervigilance is a long-term psychological state frequently observed in trauma survivors, characterized by a persistent and heightened state of alertness to potential danger. This hyper-aroused condition is not simply about being more cautious. It reflects a fundamental rewiring of the brain's threat detection and response systems, particularly the amygdala, hippocampus, and hypothalamic pituitary adrenal (HPA) axis. In individuals exposed to trauma, especially prolonged or inescapable trauma, the brain adapts to a hostile environment by becoming oversensitive to stimuli that could signal threat. The amygdala becomes hyper-responsive, scanning for danger in every situation, even when there is no objective risk. Simultaneously, the hippocampus, which helps contextualize and store memory, may struggle to distinguish between past trauma and current experiences, leading to false alarms and intrusive memories that seem present and immediate. The HPA axis floods the body with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline, resulting in physiological symptoms such as elevated heart rate, muscle tension, and gastrointestinal distress. Over time, this creates a body and mind that are perpetually braced for danger. While hypervigilance may have been adaptive during the trauma, enabling survival by identifying and avoiding threats, it becomes maladaptive in post-trauma life, where such continuous alertness impairs functioning and quality of life. Individuals suffering from chronic hypervigilance often report difficulties sleeping due to their inability to relax or feel safe, frequent startle responses to minor stimuli, and a persistent sense of being on edge. This hyper-awareness affects attention and concentration, as the mind is continuously diverted to scanning the environment for threats rather than focusing on tasks or enjoying the present moment. Over time, cognitive fatigue can set in, contributing to memory problems, emotional exhaustion, and a collapse in executive functioning. Social interactions also become fraught, as survivors may interpret neutral or ambiguous cues as threatening. For example, a raised voice or sudden movement, even if benign, may trigger a disproportionate fear response. This damages trust and communication in relationships, making it difficult to establish intimacy or feel emotionally safe with others. Furthermore, hypervigilance contributes to co-occurring disorders such as generalized anxiety disorder, obsessive-compulsive tendencies, and panic attacks. The body's chronic engagement in the fight-or-flight response leads to somatic illnesses as well, including hypertension, chronic pain, and immune system dysregulation. In many cases, hypervigilance contributes to social isolation, as the outside world is perceived as unpredictable or unsafe. Individuals may avoid public places, social gatherings, or even routine activities like commuting or grocery shopping. Because trauma can occur in relational contexts, hypervigilance often becomes interpersonal. Survivors scan faces, tones of voice, or body language for signs of deception, anger, or danger, even in trusted relationships. This continuous monitoring erodes the foundation of emotional connection and makes it difficult for survivors to feel present or authentic with others. Treatments that address hypervigilance often focus on body-based interventions such as somatic experiencing, sensoromotor psychotherapy, and mindfulness-based stress reduction. These methods help recalibrate the nervous system by teaching the individual to notice bodily sensations, discharge accumulated stress, and retrain the system to recognize safety. Cognitive approaches may also be used to help reframe misperceptions and provide tools for self-soothing. However, progress is often slow as the body's alarm system has become conditioned over years or decades of repeated activation. In essence, chronic hypervigilance is a legacy of trauma that blurs the boundary between past and present, making safety feel elusive and rest feel dangerous. It is not a sign of weakness or paranoia, but a deeply ingrained survival strategy that must be gently unwound through consistent, trauma-informed intervention. Left unaddressed, chronic hypervigilance can erode mental and physical health, strain relationships, and perpetuate the core fear that the world, and one's own body, can never truly be safe. Interpersonal difficulties. Trauma leaves a lasting imprint not only on the individual's internal world but also on their capacity for interpersonal connection. One of the most enduring effects of trauma is the disruption of attachment systems and relational patterns, resulting in chronic difficulties in trust, intimacy, boundary setting, and emotional reciprocity. Issues stem from a variety of trauma-induced cognitive and emotional changes that distort how individuals perceive others and how they behave in relationships. When trauma, particularly developmental or relational trauma, occurs, it frequently damages a person's fundamental assumptions about safety, reliability, and human intention. Survivors often learn, implicitly or explicitly, that people are unsafe, unpredictable, or dangerous. These beliefs may not always be consciously held, but they influence behavior at a subconscious level, leading to relational strategies rooted in either hypervigilance and control or detachment and avoidance. Insecure attachment styles are common, with many trauma survivors exhibiting anxious, preoccupied behaviors, clinging, fear of abandonment, hypersensitivity to rejection, or avoidance strategies, emotional numbing, distancing, difficulty expressing needs. Some may vacillate between both poles, creating chaotic and painful relationship dynamics. Trust becomes an enormous barrier. Survivors may find it nearly impossible to believe that others will not hurt, abandon, or betray them, even when there is no evidence to support such fears. As a result, they may test relationships through push-pull behaviors, self-sabotage, or emotional withdrawal. Conversely, some survivors may become overly dependent or compliant in relationships, driven by a fear of being alone or re-traumatized. Additionally, trauma often impairs one's ability to identify, assert, and maintain personal boundaries. Individuals may struggle to say no, protect themselves, or recognize when others are violating their space. Behaviors often linked to earlier experiences of helplessness or boundary violations. These interpersonal difficulties are further compounded by emotional dysregulation and dissociation, which can make communication confusing or inconsistent. For example, a person may appear emotionally distant or cold even when they are internally distressed, or they may explode in frustration without being able to articulate why. These patterns make sustaining healthy, reciprocal relationships a profound challenge. Trauma also impacts sexual intimacy and romantic attachment, often manifesting in fear, shame, or confusion around vulnerability and physical closeness. In friendships and workplace dynamics, survivors may struggle with authority figures, interpret neutral feedback as criticism, or fear being judged for their trauma history. These interpersonal difficulties can lead to chronic loneliness, low self-worth, and further internalization of the belief that one is too damaged to connect with others. Therapy approaches such as relational psychodynamic therapy, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, and group therapy can help survivors unlearn maladaptive relational patterns and rebuild a sense of trust in others. Psychoeducation about attachment, communication, and boundaries is often essential in this process. However, healing relational wounds requires not only insight but new relational experiences that contradict the individual's past. Over time, with patience and repeated positive interactions, trauma survivors can learn to engage in relationships from a place of empowerment rather than fear. In conclusion, interpersonal difficulties are a central and often painful legacy of trauma, affecting how individuals seek, form, and maintain relationships across all domains of life. These difficulties reflect deeply rooted adaptations to unsafe environments and are not signs of character flaws, but they require dedicated healing work to repair. Trauma-induced dissociation. Dissociation is a complex and often misunderstood long-term psychological response to trauma that involves disruptions in consciousness, memory, identity, perception, or bodily awareness. It arises as a defense mechanism in response to overwhelming events, serving to compartmentalize traumatic experiences that the psyche is unable to process. While dissociation may protect an individual during the trauma by creating psychological distance from intolerable sensations or emotions, it often persists long after the danger has passed, evolving into a chronic, maladaptive coping strategy. Trauma-induced dissociation exists on a spectrum, ranging from common experiences such as daydreaming or zoning out to more severe manifestations like depersonalization, derealization, identity fragmentation, or amnesia. In the context of chronic or repeated trauma, especially early life trauma, dissociative patterns become embedded into the fabric of a person's mental functioning. Depersonalization involves feeling detached from one's body or sense of self, as though watching oneself from outside. Derealization refers to a distorted perception of the environment where surroundings may appear foggy, dreamlike, or unreal. These experiences can be intermittent or persistent, and often lead to confusion, panic, and further emotional isolation. In more severe cases, such as dissociative identity disorder, DID, the psyche creates separate identity states to manage the overwhelming burden of trauma, each with its own memories, behaviors, and emotional responses. Memory gaps and time loss are common in dissociative disorders, as are feelings of being fragmented or not whole. Dissociation can interfere with daily functioning, impairing concentration, decision-making, and social interaction. It may also prevent individuals from integrating their trauma into conscious awareness, which complicates therapeutic progress due to its complex and shifting presentations. Survivors often describe feeling emotionally numb, disconnected from reality, or unable to access their own thoughts or emotions. This sense of disconnection extends beyond the self and impacts relationships as individuals struggle to remain present or engage meaningfully with others. Treatment of dissociation requires a trauma-informed approach that emphasizes safety, grounding, and stabilization. Therapies such as sensory-motor psychotherapy, EMDR, and IFS have shown promise in helping clients reconnect with their bodies and integrate dissociated parts of the self. Mindfulness, while helpful, must be introduced cautiously, as trauma survivors may initially find bodily awareness triggering. Healing dissociation is often slow, non-linear, and emotionally demanding, as it requires confronting painful material that has been sequestered for years. Nevertheless, recovery is possible through consistent therapeutic alliance, psychoeducation, and internal compassion. In conclusion, trauma-induced dissociation is not merely a symptom but a deeply embedded adaptation to overwhelming experiences. It reflects the psyche's ingenious attempt to survive, but over time, it erodes the individual's sense of continuity, identity, and presence in the world. Addressing it is central to any comprehensive trauma recovery process. Trauma's effects may linger in the shadows, but understanding them brings light. If you see any of these signs in yourself or someone else, remember, healing is possible. It's not about erasing the past, it's about learning to live beyond it. You're not alone in this journey, and there's always hope for recovery. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more insights on mental health and healing.